Welcome everyone to this workshop. My name is Adam McCormick. I am a professor of social work at St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, where I teach a range of courses on topics related to childhood trauma and family systems and child welfare. And today, we're going to talk about something that, as I'm sure, probably had a lot to do with why you decided to view this workshop, a topic that has a lot of relevance in our work quite a bit these days, perhaps even in ways that it hasn't ever before, and that's the experiences of children of undocumented parents and migrant and refugee children across the United States. With increased enforcement, many of us are hearing stories, whether it's on the news or from colleagues, or if we're working in schools or community centers, perhaps even from some of the clients that, and some of the students and some of the children that we're working with, stories of kids who are overwhelmed with stress, overwhelmed in terms of vigilance, worried about their families, worried about their parents. I was recently watching a news story of a young girl. I believe she was in 6th grade, and she had gone to the school nurse every single day for nearly 2 weeks, complaining about stomach ache and headaches. And ultimately what the nurse figured out was that the little girl just wanted to go home because she was so worried that her parents might not be there at the end of the day, or that something was going to happen to them. I was actually doing a trauma training recently for a group of undocumented workers here in Texas. I'm in Austin, Texas, and a gentleman showed me a text thread with his little daughter, who was maybe her 7th and 8th grade, a couple days after the inauguration, where she had just texted him several dozen times throughout the day, just checking to say, "Hey, Dad, are you okay? Dad, are you okay?" And he just, you could just see he would text back real quick, "I'm fine, everything's okay, do your schoolwork." And so this is a topic that I think has a lot of relevance and perhaps a lot of urgency for many of us. So I want to teach some of the kind of core principles of trauma-informed care, and perhaps do my best to try to connect them to the experiences of undocumented or children of undocumented families and migrant, refugee, immigrant young people and their families, and also talk a little bit about how this work can impact you as a practitioner and as a social worker. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started, and I thought it would be a good place to start to really just kind of make some clear distinctions around what trauma is and what it isn't, and then again kind of tie that into to this population that we're talking about today. So when we think about trauma, oftentimes in our society, whether it's in schools, in media, just in society in general, and sometimes even in our work in social work, we don't make these distinctions, but we oftentimes think about trauma as being the bad thing that happens to a child, or the bad things that happen to a child. For instance, if we're talking about, a child who is separated from their family, or they deal with the trauma of watching their parents being detained and or deported or something like that. We think of that as being the trauma that a child experiences, and that's understandable. But the reality is that those are actually the bad events, or the bad things that happen to a child. I had if I'm a child who had a really dangerous journey into the United States, if I'm separated from some members of my family, I'm separated from my siblings or my parents, those are the traumatic events or experiences that they've had. But trauma isn't what happens to a child. Rather, trauma is what happens inside of a child because of, in this instance, the bad things that happen to them, right? And so if I'm living in a state of vigilance, constantly in a state of fear that my parents aren't going to be home at the end of the day, or I'm constantly on alert trying to predict or prevent threat. The trauma is the internal wound that I experience, the psychic wound that I experience from that those bad things that happen to me, or the fear of those bad things that are happening to me. And the trauma is also all of the ways that I might adapt to that as a child. All the things that I do, perhaps kind of going small, keeping big things a secret, never asking for help, right? All of the adaptive things that I have to engage, all of the coping skills, all of the narratives that I construct about myself or about the world or about people or government or whatever it might be. That's the trauma. Trauma is not the bad thing that happens to a child or even the bad things that happen to a child, but what happens inside of them because of those bad things. And perhaps with this population, it would be equally as important for us to recognize that in much the same way that trauma is, right, what happens inside of a child because of the bad things that do happen to them, trauma is also what happens inside of a child in the wounds and the narratives that they construct and the adaptations that they develop, not just because of the bad things that happen to them, but the good things that don't happen for them. And if I'm in a constant state of vigilance or survival mode or whatever it might be, it's going to be very, very difficult or if my family's in a constant state of vigilance, a constant state of survival, and they're so focused on safety, so focused on survival, or I'm spending so much of my time, right, trying to care for my siblings or whatever it might be to make up for this vigilance, right, or this over-functioning that my family has to do in order to survive and protect the family system and stay off the radar or whatever it might do. The trauma would be the internal wounds that come with that, the narratives that a child constructs around that, the adaptations that they develop to those experiences as well. And I always tell social workers this when we're working with children or adults. This definition, this understanding of trauma as it being what happens inside of a child because of the bad things that happen to them or the good things that don't happen for them, that provides us as clinicians and as practitioners and as the people who are tasked with the responsibility of healing those wounds, of helping these kids to regulate in the midst of this level of stress and hypervigilance, of holding space and doing all of the amazing things that you all do every single day in your professional lives as social workers. This gives us some sense of hope. Because if we think about this, if we talk about, let's say a child who has to deal with the trauma of a family separation, or a child who has fled, their family had to flee to the United States in order to escape violence or extreme poverty or whatever it might be. That child, as much as they might hope and as much as we might hope, right, and as much as they might try to repress it and not think about it, they can never have not had those experiences of family separation or extreme poverty or whatever the conditions were that their family perhaps had to flee here. But that's not the trauma. The trauma is the internal wound, and we can heal those wounds. We can create new neural networks. We can, right, create relationships and connection in environments that are much safer, right, where there's a lot of solidarity and there's a lot of community, there's a lot of connection, a lot of safety for that child. So I oftentimes start when I lecture on this topic with really helping folks to understand what trauma is and what it isn't, because I do think, one, it's helpful to understand this as an internal wound. It's really, really important to understand all of the things that a child has done to adapt and to survive and to cope as being a part of that trauma. But most importantly, to give us as social workers, and hopefully we can relay this and convey this to our clients and help them to feel this, it gives us some hope here. We can never not have had the bad things happen to the kids that we work with. Right? And perhaps this is one population, especially right now, where those things are really bad and a lot of the good stuff isn't happening for them. But the trauma is the wound, and we can heal wounds. It's going to take a lot of work, and we're going to talk about what that work looks like. But it's a really, really important distinction for us to understand. The other thing that I think is really important to understand foundationally, just as we kind of get going here, is especially when we look at the experiences of migrant, immigrant, refugee, youth, children of undocumented parents, mixed status children, as resilient and as resourceful as they might be, no child or adult, but especially a child, is wired for this level of stress. This is just too much stress on their little brains, on their little bodies, on their little nervous systems. Let me kind of explain a little bit how that stress works and in where trauma plays into that. So we're fundamentally wired for stress in two ways. The first one we know quite a bit about, and that's acute stress, threshold stress. We're wired for stress up until a certain threshold. I always do a bear analogy in the classroom with my students, and I tell my students, if a bear were to come through the door in the middle of class, obviously the threat of that bear attack would clearly max the level of stress, the threshold of stress that we're wired for. All right, and what would happen would, we don't need to activate and use the really complicated, sophisticated, complex regions of our cortex and figure out where that bear is from and what region. And no, right? We're not going to care about that. We don't want to do that. We are going to shut down that higher order system and engage that low order system, fight, flight, or freeze system, in an effort to try to survive this really, really threatening, dangerous, and overwhelming attack from this bear. Right? And that's because we're not wired for that level of stress. That low order system is going to shut down that high order system, and it's going to be all about safety, all about survival, all about fight, all about flight or freeze in that moment. Now, the hallmark feature of traumatic stress is re-experiencing these things long after that threat. So what we do know about many children, especially children who came to the United States and experienced perhaps trauma in their country of origin that they had to flee, or journey migration trauma that they experienced on their journeys to the United States, or if they dealt with the trauma of family separation and all the other forms of domestic violence, whatever it might be, right, that many kids who are children of undocumented parents, migrant, refugee kids, they've experienced some of these threshold traumas. And the hallmark feature, right, of traumatic stress, threshold traumatic stress, right, acute traumatic stress, is that, as I tell my students, you're responding to a bear attack when there's really no bear present there for you. Right? Your internal system is responding to something, a threat from long ago. And in those survival-related experiences, right, that are stored up in that low order system, and in here it's perhaps just as important that we understand a little bit about the memory of acute traumatic stress. And the only thing that we store in those low order systems are previous experiences, previous emotions, previous thoughts, cognitions that we experienced during the initial traumas there, so that should we encounter something that even faintly resembles that in the future, I'm going to have that implicit memory stored up, especially those emotions, so that I can react in appropriate way, that I can survive. Now, what does that mean? That means for kids who experience acute stress, right, what they're re-experiencing here, and that's quite literally what happens. Right, that low order system just floods the nervous system, floods the body, right, with that memory, very choppy, fragmented, disoriented memory, you bet, but more so with the emotions and the cognitions from that they previously experienced. And so when we say that a kid is flooded or a kid is triggered, and I'll talk about those triggers here in a little bit, it becomes really, really important for us to understand what is it that kids are flooded with? What is it that kids are reliving? What is it that they're re-experiencing here? And if I'm re-experiencing survival-related emotions, meaning I'm quite literally re-experiencing the same stress or the same fear or the same anger or the same shame that I experienced from some previous time where there was a threat to my safety or a threat to my survival, those survival-related emotions are going to elicit really strong survival-related responses. And I'm not really responding to the here and the now, right? I'm actually responding to the there and the then. And so that's threshold trauma. And when we think about the stress, in the fear, in the vigilance that many children right now, children of undocumented parents, migrant refugee kids, that they're experiencing right now, that clearly maxes that threshold for which we're wired for. It's just too much stress on their little brains and their little bodies. And a lot of times we look, because this is a very resilient population. Absolutely. Many of us have several examples of kids who we work with, kids on our caseload, perhaps students, right, who are really, really resilient. And while yes, that is true, the reality is no matter who you are as a child, when you experience adversity, that experience is going to have an impact on you. When I teach this lesson to my students, what I do is I throw a couple of Nerf balls and Squishmallow toys out to the students, and I mangle them up really, really bad, and I throw them to the students, and I say, you guys put those back to like they were before. And then I take a wire hanger and I mangle it all up, and I throw a couple of those out to students, and I say, you guys put that back together just the way that it was before, and whoever finishes first can get extra credit on the exam. Well, that's wildly unfair. And the reason that it's unfair, because the students who I throw the Squishmallow and the Nerf ball to, by the time they get it, it's already bounced back to its original form. It doesn't look like anything. And for the kids with the wire hanger, even if they take 20 or 30 minutes trying to put that thing back together, they can never make it look like it did before I mangled it up for them. And when it comes to resilience, we have to understand, right, no matter who the kid is, right, that resilience operates a lot more like that wire hanger. Sure, they can bounce back, right, but that experience isn't going to have some impact on them, some impact on their nervous system, some impact on the narratives that they create about themselves and about the world, some impact on the adaptations that they might develop, triggers that they might now have moving forward. So that's the first part of stress that I wanted to kind of define. But the second part, and perhaps this one has just as much utility to our conversation today, right, has to do with the longevity for which we're wired for stress. So I just told you we're wired for stress, one that meets a certain threshold. Well, we're also only wired for stress that is temporary. And once an event, right, or I'm sorry, an experience or a dynamic in a child's life maxes that temporal period for which we're wired for stress, that too is traumatic for them. You think about kids who grow up in abject poverty. Certainly you think about kids who live in the shadows of immigration, who are constantly in a state of fear or vigilance that they or their parents or their loved ones or family members could be detained or deported at a moment's notice. You think about, I do a lot of work here in Texas with LGBTQ kids in the foster care system, a kid who grows up in a really rejecting home, or a home where they constantly have to be on guard or hide big aspects of their identity, their sexuality. Those are examples of that chronic stress that clearly maxes that temporal period for which we're wired for stress. And in fact, to demonstrate this to my students, I'll show them brain scans, lower order amygdala scans of children who've experienced pretty horrific sexual abuse, 9 to 12-year-old kids. And I tell them, get a good idea of what their lower order, what their amygdalas look like, and then we compare those to kids who have no trauma, and they get a good understanding of how their brains are different, how they look different. And then we look at brain scans of kids who have experienced extreme poverty here in the United States, extreme poverty and homelessness. And we look at their low order systems, and they're almost indistinguishable from the kids who've experienced the abuse. And that kind of demonstrates, although these are two different forms of trauma, chronic stress and trauma, threshold stress, acute trauma, they manifest in some ways that are very, very simple, but both being traumatic for those kids. And when we're talking about this population, children of undocumented parents, migrant refugee children, they experience oftentimes both of these, right? Many of them might have experiences of acute trauma, especially if they were fleeing or their families were fleeing some type of violence or stress or gang violence or whatever it might be, but also, right, the chronic stress of vigilance. I'm going to, later on in this conversation, really help us understand how the vigilance right now is really more of an acute form of stress, because many of these kids right now are feeling as though at any moment their loved ones, their parents, can be taken away from them, and that's a safety, right? An immediate threat to my safety and my survival. So I thought it'd be really important for us to kind of understand some of this foundationally, to better understand some of these the adaptations that we commonly see in young people. I do too want to look at this, the developmental aspects of this, especially for younger children under the age of 10, 12 years old. Children are like sponges to their environment. And that's a really, really cool thing. You think about a child who's learning how to read. We know that developmentally there's a certain period in time where if we read to them, they're just going to soak that up. It's going to quite literally organize into their developing brains. And we know kind of the sequential nature of how the brain develops. When some of those experiences develop early on, it kind of creates a filter or a lens for which everything else can develop. And especially when the more top parts of the brain develop, the more complicated, sophisticated parts of the brain develop. You think about technology. A kid picks up an iPad or an iPhone or something, and they got it figured out really, really quick. You think about language. Several years ago now, my wife came back from a trip to Jordan where she was doing some work, and she said, I want to teach you and the kids some Arabic. And so she started to teach us some Arabic, and my daughters were like 3 and 4 at that time, and they were just picking it up like nothing, and I was not picking it up. My brain is already developed, right? It is what it is. But that experience was quite literally organizing into their development. They were just soaking it up like a sponge. Think about math, reading, arithmetic, language, technology. Children are like sponges to their environment. And the reason for that is those experiences don't just change their brain, they organize in at these really, really seminal, malleable moments. And everything else develops around that. Now, that's an awesome thing if we're talking about learning a new language, or learning technology, or arithmetic, or reading, or whatever it might be. It's not such a good thing when we talk about trauma and adversity, because the younger a child is, right, and many of us are seeing this stress in kids 5, 6, 7 years old, sometimes even younger than that. These experiences, this state of vigilance, hypervigilance that they're in, right? These conversations that they have to have with their families, the fear that they're experiencing right now is quite literally organizing into their developing brain as everything else develops. They are even more susceptible, more like sponges to the adversity and the trauma in their little worlds. And for some of them, they're so young that these experiences, right, are happening at a time where they'll never have explicit memory or narrative memory to connect this stress, to connect this fear, to connect these adaptations that they're engaging to their environment, to their life. But we know that those implicit memories, those implicit experiences, when we experience it before we have the narrative memory for something, are far more lasting and far more consequential for young people than even explicit memories of trauma. And that's not to diminish or dismiss just how profoundly those traumas impact kids. And so we have to be thinking about the developmental nature. How are these experiences, especially if these really, really young kids, 3, 4, 5 years old, how are they organizing into the developing brains and bodies and nervous systems of these kiddos, of these young people? So kids are like sponges to their environment, and we think about kids in a constant state of stress. And many of us have heard stories of first graders and second graders. I think this one of the stories that I saw, I think it was on New York Times or CNN, was a second grade girl who had a tummy ache every day for 2 weeks. These experiences are going to have an even more lasting and profound impact on them. We wire for the world that we are going to live in, or that we do live in, especially in early childhood. And let me give an example here. Let's say we have a baby born to a family, and let's say 2 babies are born in a hospital. I'm here in Texas. We'll pretend it's here in Texas. And let's say that the first baby's born to a family, and there's 2 parents there, and they don't have a lot of stress in their lives, and they don't have a lot of their own trauma to tend to, or they've already tended to. This is all hypothetical. And let's say they just have a huge support system of family and friends and neighbors, and let's pretend that one of the parents has a year of paid leave, and then the other parent can take the next year off of paid leave. And of course, if you're in America, you probably have no idea what I would be talking about right now, because we don't do that for people. But we're going to pretend. And so in these parents just can't get enough, and in their family and support system just can't get enough of this little baby. Right? That baby is going to wire for a world based on their template of experience. We all, and this is a social work 101, probably every one of us learned this about the second day of social work class. We all answer to our environment, person in the environment, human behavior in the social environment. At the end of the day, we answer to our environment. Our brain is a meaning-making machine, meaning we give it an environment, a template of experiences. It makes sense out of that and gives us back the resources that we need to survive and perhaps to thrive in that environment. And so if that baby's born into that world, of course, the brain's going to say, okay, I make meaning out of this environment. I have a good idea of what this environment looks like based upon the template of experiences that you've given me. A lot of warmth, a lot of nurture, a lot of connection, a lot of relationship. Your needs are met. Your world is safe. I'm going to give back to you the resources that you are going to need in this world that is warm, relational, rich, sweet, and safe. And that is great for that baby. But let's imagine a small child, a baby is born right next door, and let's imagine that their parents are in a constant state of vigilance every single day, and perhaps they're dealing with poverty and job loss that we're seeing right now with a lot of undocumented folks. And they're dealing with some traumas of family separation, and they're just in a constant state of vigilance, in a constant state of stress, right? For their young children, right, they might wire for an entirely different world. Now, what we know is, right, families are providing so much love and nurture and care and attention despite these stressors, right? But these stressors are going to impact them, right? We can't come out unscathed, right? So that baby might wire for an entirely different world based upon their experiences, A world where their parents are constantly in a state of vigilance, constantly in a state of stress, constantly in a state of dysregulation. Or if you think about 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, if their parents are right, the greatest gift that we can give to our children is the gift of our own regulation and happiness. Well, it's really, really hard to remain regulated and happy and well if you're worried about the threats, or your family being separated or torn apart or whatever it might be. And so the stress that families are experiencing right now, the vigilance, the hypervigilance that families are living in right now, is we are contagious, especially in childhood, to the inner experiences of our parents. That's why I tell parents all the time. I teach a lot of parenting classes here in Texas. The greatest gift that you can give your child is your own regulation, your own happiness. It's almost impossible for an undocumented parent to give that gift to their child right now. How could you be regulated? How could you not be scared? How could you not chronically be in a state of panic or fear or stress right now? And children are absorbing that stress. Right? We are emotionally contagious creatures. No greater example of that than the contagion, right? The ways that a child quite literally absorbs the inner experiences of their parents. So the ways that children are sponges to their environment, how that trauma organizes into their developing brains and bodies and nervous systems becomes really, really important for us to understand here. All right. And so because we re-experience in childhood the stress and the pain and in the fear, right, quite literally the same stress, pain, fear, anguish, whatever it might be, that a child experienced during the initial threat, what's happening is, right, we don't so much remember childhood trauma, especially the developmental stuff I was just talking about. For many of these kids, they'll never have narrative memory of these times. You don't remember the trauma in childhood as much as you relive the very adaptations that you had to use to survive and cope and adapt to it. And that becomes a really, really important thing for us to understand here. What are the adaptations? And how do we understand these adaptations in the context of what's going on politically and socially right now? For many kids, if they're scared, if they're worried, if they're sad, when a child is scared or worried and sad, you would go to your teacher, you would go to your school social worker, you would go to a coach or whoever it might be and express that, right? Or, you would expect somebody to help you in those moments. Well, right now for a lot of kids, they can't do that. It's just too risky for them to do that. Not to mention, we know that many kids are being removed from the very activities, whether it's school or sports or extracurricular activities, the very things that would actually be the experiences that would help them to regulate this fear and this stress, right? It would be one thing if I'm in this state of fear, but I could talk to my school social worker, or my parents had me set up in some counseling, or I did sports at the end of the day, or I had a swimming thing that I went, or whatever it might be. But what we know is parents, undocumented parents, mixed status parents, right? They're pulling those kids from those activities for good reason, because they're afraid of being on the radar. They're really, really afraid, right? They're not leaving the house because it's really, really risky to leave the house, right? And so all of the things that would regulate the stress and the fear and the vigilance that these kids are dealing with right now are kind of off limits for them. So if I'm sad, and previously I would go to my teacher and say I'm sad or I'm scared, I can't do that now. I'm going to have to just endure that or suppress that or keep that to myself. And what I tell folks all the time when it comes to childhood trauma, the only thing worse than experiencing childhood trauma, in this case, the trauma of increased enforcement in the fear of deportation and the fear of family separation, the only thing worse than to experience that kind of trauma is to experience it all alone. Because now my teachers, my school social workers, my coaches, my parents, perhaps because they're so vigilant and scared and preoccupied right now, they can't name that for me. Not just that they can't help me. Half the battle, right? If many of us can think about this, if we thought about some of the most painful moments in childhood where we were really lonely or scared or hurt or humiliated, and we didn't have, especially an adult in our life who could just name that for us. We know, right, the pain of dealing with that all alone. That if we just had an adult, even if they weren't going to try to fix it for us, right, even if they just named it and said, this is what's going on. This shouldn't have happened to you. This was wrong. You shouldn't have to live like in this constant state of fear, whatever it might be. Just having that named, right, or you shouldn't have been treated that way. Just having that named is so healing and so regulating for a child. In not only for a lot of migrant and refugee kids right now and children of undocumented parents, not only are their wounds and their hurts and their fears and their vigilance not being named, intended to, right, they're seeing what the rhetoric is. Perhaps they're hearing it from classmates. We had a thing happen here in my area a couple months back, where it was a high school basketball game, and some of the fans, it was a school that was entirely Hispanic school, many kids who were from mixed status or undocumented families. The student section for the opposing team were screaming out, slurs and yelling, mass deportation and all sorts of really, really harmful stuff. So then they're seeing the news, they're hearing this, right, this rhetoric. So not only is it that I'm experiencing these wounds, in these hurts and these pains and this fear, but there's a big segment of my world, my society, perhaps even my community, that are either celebrating this or at least kind of rationalizing or justifying it and kind of saying this is just the way that things have to be. So now I have to feel this way. I have to be scared like this. I have to worry about my family being. I have to live in a constant state of vigilance, because, or at least somebody's telling me that things just have to be this way. The only thing worse than to experience childhood trauma is to experience it alone. I'm going to make a case for that here in a little bit. And so for undocumented families, the children in those families are oftentimes experiencing this in many ways alone for many of these reasons. Let's talk a little bit about understanding some of the triggers of these kiddos. When we experience trauma, whether it's threshold trauma or relational or emotional trauma, moving forward, remember that experience gets stored up in my lower order system so that in the future, should I encounter anything that even faintly resembles something from that moment or that experience or that relationship, that's going to trigger that internal memory, that implicit memory, those implicit emotions, those implicit thoughts, so that I know how to respond. I can keep safe. All right. And so if we were in a room, even for us as adults, but you can imagine what this would look like for small children, especially children who are mixed status or their parents are undocumented, they're undocumented. When we enter a space, especially a new space, we don't realize this is all done subconsciously, but our brain is running a scan. The low order system of our brain is running a scan. Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? About 4 times every second, our brain does that for us. In what it's looking at here, right, is there anything in my environment that looks or feels like something from past experiences where there was a threat to my safety or my survival, where I felt an overwhelming sense of fear or humiliation or whatever it might be? If the answer to that, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, am I safe, is yes, then I'm going to work up to the top parts of my brain, to my cortex, and I can process my class or something like that. But if the answer to that is no, right, there's something in your environment, perhaps a sight, a sound, a smell, a person, right, something, a physiological sensation that even faintly resembles something from my past where there was a threat to my safety or my survival. If the answer is to no, right, my brain is going to stay down in that lower order system. And for kids right now, when you're in that lower order system, let's imagine for a second that we're in a big building, and I'm giving this lecture in a physical space, and we're all together. And just out of nowhere, my phone rings, and I answer my phone, and I take a call, which would be very rude, but just pretend I did it anyway. And I took the call, and the call went a little something like this. Yeah, this is Adam. Oh my goodness, wow, in the space that we're in, the bomb squad is walking around. They've got a credible threat. Oh my goodness, that is so scary. Wow, you're going to leave that decision up to me? Yeah, we're going to stay. Yeah, because we've promised CEUs to the folks in the room here. We're going to have to stick this one out. Yeah, we'll have to agree to disagree on that one, officer. Yeah, I tell you what, if you get any more information, why don't you give me a call back? Okay, thank you. Imagine I take that call. That just happened for you all. Now, hopefully, for most of us, whatever CEUs you're going to get for this presentation would not be important enough for you to stick around. But let's pretend it's the end of the year and I'm doing ethics and you really need those CEUs. And I just keep going on with this workshop or this lecture, and I'm just understanding trauma triggers. And I just keep going on like nothing. How difficult is it going to be for you to pay attention to that lecture, to that workshop? It's going to be almost impossible for you to do that. Now, that might sound like an extreme example, but how different is that example than what we're asking children to do right now, especially small children, when we say, hey, here's what's going on, or they hear their parents, or they feel what's going on inside of their families and their parents and their peers and their classmates. They watch the news, whatever it might be. And we say, it's okay, go to class. Go sit through that 4th grade math class or 7th grade algebra lecture or whatever it might be. How much attention, right? How attuned is that child going to be to math class or English class or whatever it might be? They're going to try, right? But they're going to be so focused on safety, so focused on survival, so focused on threat, so preoccupied with what could possibly be going on back at home or at dad's work site or mom's work site, that it's going to be almost impossible for them, right, to be in the moment, to tend to what they need to tend to here. And as social workers and teachers and educators, we have to be mindful of that reality. Right? So anything that faintly resembles something from my past can really serve now as this evocative internal cue, this trigger for me. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, I was working as a therapist with a kiddo who was 9. This was not an immigration case, but I think it's still, there's some teaching components to this that I think would be helpful here. He was in foster care, and his foster parents would bring him out for counseling every week, and they always had nothing but sweet things to say about really endearing, really sweet kid. But every week, the kid would have a big blow up, right? And it was always at breakfast time, and it was always on Saturday or Sunday mornings. And so we tracked data in our agency to try to see everything that we could to identify what could have triggered these responses, especially these ones where a child's response to the moment is just completely disproportionate to what's going on, right? And that's what was happening here. And sure enough, what we found was when this kid was back home, well, in the foster home, Saturday or Sunday mornings, the foster parents would make a big breakfast, bacon and eggs, sausage, pancakes, chorizo, all the good stuff. You can't do that during the week. They had 4 kids, 5 kids in their home. Anybody who grew up in a big family, you know this. You got 5 kids in a home. You're lucky if your parents are throwing you a Pop-Tart on the way out the door. if you're lucky. So they couldn't do that during the week, but so on the weekends, they'd like to make a big breakfast. Well, it turns out when this kid was back at home, mom would leave for work, big sister would go to school. The boy, very small, was left at home with mom's boyfriend, who would do bad things to him and then go cook sausage and eggs and bacon. And so when they would cook the sausage, the smell, taste, whatever it was this really, really evocative internal trigger reminder. Remember, the lower order system always gets first dibs on an experience, especially a new experience. And if an experience, right, resembles something from my past, a child's not going to come out of that lower. I'm going to stay in those fight, flight, freeze regions of my brain here. Right? Or if I'm in a higher order, right, state, and something enters my environment, right, that faintly resembles something painful or threatening from my past, that's going to shut down that lower system is just going to take over. It's going to hijack the moment. And so we have to be mindful of that as well. Think about it. If I'm a 9-year-old kid, I'm brushing my teeth at night, my dad comes home, he starts beating up on my mom, and I experience that, I witness that, or I try to intervene. Now all of a sudden, the taste of the toothpaste, the sound of the running water, the sight of the toilet, right, the flushing toilet, all those sounds, right, all of that sort of stuff can now get stored up in that lower order system. And now those things, even though they're harmless to me in my environment, they can serve as these really evocative cues, right? The trigger. Now, the trigger, is one of my favorite authors, Gabor Mate, often says, the trigger is only, if you think about a firearm, is only one component of the firearm. So sure, we want to know, right, what it is that triggers kids, what their triggers are. And again, for many children of undocumented parents, kids who have especially made very dangerous journeys here, they might have a lot of trauma, meaning that they have a lot of triggers. But I also, and perhaps want to be even more concerned with, what is the ammunition, the fear, the anger, the pain, the vigilance that's behind that trigger, the narratives that kids construct that's behind that trigger. So we want to understand the adaptive nature of trauma. Kids don't necessarily just remember, right, or have these explicit flashbacks of what happened to them. They relive the very adaptations that they had to engage to survive and attach. And right now, in this moment, kids are developing some pretty strong adaptations. They're going silent, they're going small, they're keeping to themselves, perhaps they're lashing out, they're doing all sorts of stuff to adapt to the threat right now. That's going to get stored up. We are going to see the effects of that in the future as we work with these kiddos. I'm actually going to skip that just because of time, and I do want to talk about this one. Any one of us, if we think about childhood, and for some of us even still now, right, we recognize that we are narrative creatures, meaning that we understand the world through stories. And this is one of the really cool things about especially early childhood. We understand the right. So things happen to us. We have a world. We have an environment. We tell ourselves a story to make those experiences and to make that environment make sense to us. Right? We are narrative creatures. I teach an undergraduate class to 18-year-old, most of them 18-year-old students. I know when I'm teaching something really, really complicated or complex or sophisticated, I immediately have to tell them a story or give them a case. Otherwise, it's going to go right over their heads. And that's because they too, even though they're a little bit older, they're narrative. They understand the world through stories. And so in childhood, we create these narratives. We create these stories. And oftentimes the ones that govern us and guide us and rule us in many ways are the narratives that we constructed, typically in the scariest or loneliest, most threatening or frightening experiences of childhood. Those are the narratives that have the most force or power, stick with us the longest. So think about how cruel, this is one of the cruelest things about childhood trauma, especially developmental trauma. The stories that I live by, the stories that I create to understand my world, the stories that I create to understand people, and most importantly, myself, are the ones that I created and constructed in the scariest, loneliest, most frightening and stressful moments of my childhood. But that's not it. Not only do we construct these stories, typically in the scariest, loneliest, most frightening moments of childhood, but then once we've constructed them, we work like crazy to reinforce them and to corroborate them and to confirm those narratives. Let me give you a story here to expand on the narrative nature here. I've worked my entire adult life with kids in foster care. 24 years ago, my wife and I were living house parents at a children's home in West Texas, and we lived with some of the most at-risk, emotionally and behaviorally at-risk kids in the state of Texas foster care system. We loved it. We did it for a long time. We just absolutely loved it. There was a kid that we were living with at that time. He was about 14 years old. His father was trying to get him back. He had been removed from his father. His father had a ton of childhood trauma, actually grew up in the system, the same foster care system himself. Had a ton of trauma, had some addiction. Nobody was working to help his father. He was supposed to be getting all of his stuff together all on his own. You can imagine how difficult that was. And the kid, the 14-year-old, all he wanted in life was to be back with his father. This kid loved his father, and his father loved him just as much. I know it. And so dad was working like crazy, but he had so much trauma and he had so much addiction, and he was doing this all by himself. He had no support. And so every time he would get close to getting his son back, he would relapse or miss a visit or do something. And after 2 or 3 rounds of this, the judge decides to terminate dad's right. And this was really devastating for this kid. And I can remember this particular kid. We would watch the cartoon. This was a long time ago. But we would watch the cartoon Looking for Nemo. Finding Nemo was the name of the cartoon. And it was all about this dad who was trying to find his son, a fish in the ocean. And he swims across the ocean and has all of these adventures to find his son. And he would say, my dad's going to do that to get me back. He gets a call one day. This is how CPS handled this. His caseworker called the boy, 14-year-old, to tell him the judge has decided to terminate your dad's rights. We're going to have a court date at the end of the week. So the kid is just devastated. You can imagine. Just the pain, the betrayal, the anger, the fear, the confusion, just a mix of it. And I remember as a new social worker, I had just learned at that time about kind of the appropriate use of self-disclosure. And I myself, my father abandoned me when I was his age, 14, 13. And I didn't see him after that. He died a couple years later. He drank himself to death. And I thought, boy, this checks all the boxes. This seems like an appropriate time to self-disclose. And I kind of told him, hey, I know things are different, and I don't want you to think that I know what you're going through, but I want you to know you're not alone. And I remember I had this experience when I was 13 or 14. I know how hard it was. And I'm here for you if you need to talk. And it was a really good moment, in a really healing moment. And if you know anything about kids in foster care, right, one of the common narratives that they kind of live by, especially kids like this who have been separated from their families or have been abandoned by their families or whatever it might be, is I don't belong. I don't belong in a family. There's something wrong with me. I'm not worthy of love. And perhaps the most pervasive one is if you push people enough, they will give up on you. They will prove to you that you don't matter to them, or you're not worth their love or their energy or their time or their affection or attention. And so we had that moment. So we're going to fast forward about a month or two later, and he and I are battling about something. I can't even remember what it was. And I'm sure I wasn't handling it well because I wasn't trained in trauma-informed care or any of that sort of stuff back then. And he's getting really angry, and he's starting to say some really, really mean stuff to me. And it's getting meaner and meaner and meaner, and I'm trying to stay calm and cool. And it's evident that he's really trying to set me off. He's really trying to hurt my feelings. And he looks at me and he says, "No wonder why your dad left you. Anybody would leave you. You're an idiot," or something like that, right? Like he's really trying to say the thing to set me off or to hurt me, right? But more importantly, to confirm this narrative. If you push people enough, they will give up on you. And that was a really, really profound moment, right, for me as a social worker in terms of understanding the narrative nature, especially when we look at trauma. And so right now, let's think about what are some of the narratives that children of undocumented families might be constructing and creating right now? What are some of the narratives that they might be living by, right? Especially if much of their trauma and their experience and their fear and their sadness and their family's pain and fear is being weaponized in the ways that it is, right? Or especially because I can't go to somebody, right? So the narrative might be, when I'm hurt, when I'm scared, when I'm sad, I have to deal with this on my own. Or it doesn't matter. Or my fears or my pain or my sadness just have to be that way. And so we really, really want to think about, and there's a whole host of, right, we could just, I mean, if we had a bunch of time, I would tell you, just write down all of the potential narratives that a kid could be constructing right now, given what's going on politically and socially for them. And what are the things, more importantly, what are the things that they might do in an effort to corroborate and confirm and make that narrative true, or make that narrative their reality? This is perhaps the most common question when I consult on a child trauma. In fact, I cannot think of a case that I've consulted on or worked where I haven't asked that question. Foster care, migrant, refugee, undocumented kids, LGBTQ kid, it doesn't matter. I do a lot of work with masculinity and trauma, prisons and group homes. Constantly asking, what story, what narrative might this child be confirming with the behavior you're telling me about? And when we do that, we can almost always make some really, really important connections. So what are the narratives that are being constructed? One of my favorite quotes from Virginia Satir, and Bruce Perry uses this one quite frequently if you're familiar with his work, right? But this one kind of speaks to control. And right now, for a lot of kids who are undocumented, or their families are undocumented, they're mixed status family, right? They're internally feeling out of control. They have, in many instances, no control. But think about this. Think about a kid who has made a really dangerous journey with their family here, right? They're in a new country. Perhaps now their parents are really, really preoccupied. So now my only source of emotional regulation, they're dysregulated, they're scared, they're overwhelmed themselves. Right? I'm feeling all of these feelings, this fear, this vigilance, this sadness. I've got all of these narratives that we just talked about. And as children, we prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. When it comes to these narratives, think about that story that I just told you, right? That kid, right, absolutely internally, in his mind, preferred the certainty of misery, right? Me giving up on him, proving that he's not worth my time or worthy of my love or attention, to the misery of uncertainty, waiting, right, for me to decide when he's no longer worthy of that affection or love or attention, right? That's crazy making for a child, the misery of uncertainty, right? So here, another question. If these kids, these families are losing all of this control, what are the ways that they might be trying to gain back that control, right? And a lot of times the one under adaptations, people pleasing, going small, imposterism, doing all the emotional labor, right? Perhaps being more vulnerable to a toxic relationship or a coercive relationship, right? We prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. So we've talked a lot up to this point, and we're about an hour in, about the experiences of the young people who we're working with, the children of undocumented parents, migrant and refugee young people. But as I told you earlier, the greatest gift that a parent can give to a child, right, especially in moments of stress or trauma, is the gift of their own regulation, right? Their own authenticity, their own wellness. Well, not just the parents, because as social workers, the greatest gift that we can give to our clients, in this case, the families that we're working with or the children that we're working with, is the gift of our own regulation. And I get it. That is tough right now in this political context, especially if you're really passionate about issues of immigration and LGBTQ folks and poverty and that sort of stuff. I get it. It's hard for us to do that. We're scared ourselves. We're dysregulated. We're overwhelmed ourselves. But let me explain a little bit here that might hopefully encourage us a little bit to do something about our own regulation and our own care. All right. I mentioned earlier, we are contagious to the emotions of those around us. And when we experience trauma, this can apply to our own experiences. If we have experiences of trauma in our own childhood, we're oftentimes much more sensitive to the inner experiences of people. Make no mistake about it, right? We are in a field that has like a magnetic pull, and that's a good thing, a magnetic pull for empaths, folks who are very attuned to the inner experiences, the pain, the hurt, and the suffering. I just wrote a book called The Unfinished Business of Childhood, Healing the Social Worker's Childhood Wounds. And I talk all about this, right? This reality, and we all hear this thing that hurt people. Well, the reality is, and that's true, some hurt people, but far more people who experience trauma, especially in childhood, right, actually help people. They're much more empathic. They care much more about the wounds and the experiences, not only of other people who have experienced the same thing that they have, but of everyone else, right? And folks who experience family rejection, right, because of their LGBTQI identity or trauma or something, they tend to be really concerned about the effects of racism or poverty or domestic violence. Our woundedness makes us much more empathic to the hurts, much more attuned to the inner experiences of the clients and the communities that we work with. And it quite literally is a contagion. We quite literally take on the inner experience of our clients. Right? I tell this to my students all the time. You know, they always want me to give them some fancy theories, and those theories are great. And I talk about the importance of research and incorporating that into our practice. And they want this magical stuff to say to clients to change their lives. And I tell them, I get that. I was the same way when I was a student. But the reality is, it's our presence. That's where healing happens. That's where regulation happens. You're my client, in this case, a child. You're scared about your parents. You're scared about your family being separated or deported or whatever it might be. You're scared about being bullied, whatever it might be. You're scared. You're overwhelmed. You're traumatized. You're dysregulated. You come to me as your social worker. And what I'm doing more than anything else is I'm what we refer to as holding space, but we have to also explain what that means. I'm sharing my calm with you. Right? And as you're coming in more dysregulated in those bottom parts of the brain, the more that I share my calm, the more that I share my empathy, the more that I share my compassion, the more that I share my wisdom, the more that I share my cortex with you, my calm, my regulation, my empathy, my compassion, my kindness, my humor, the more you're moving up to the top parts of your brain. Right? You feel safe. You feel regulated as my client, in this case, student, child. And that's where change and transformation and healing happen for our clients. And it would be a wonderful thing if that client could, when we were done and they were feeling better and safer and had more emotional and cognitive clarity and were more stable, they could leave, and then the next kid comes in and I could just share it again with them. And then the next one comes in and I could just keep sharing it with them. But here's the thing. This contagion, the direction, is by no means one directional. It goes both ways. And the more that I'm sharing my calm, I'm quite literally sharing my calm. If I share $20 with you, another $20 bill doesn't just pop up in my wallet. I'm sharing it. I'm giving that to you. I'm sharing it. Meaning that I'm losing it. And I'm sharing my compassion, and I'm sharing my cortex, and I'm sharing my regulation with you. So what's happening for me is, even if I came into work really, really regulated and really, really authentic and really, really whole, the more that I'm sharing that, the more dysregulated I'm becoming as a social worker. All right? And the best gift that I can give my clients is my regulation, is my calm. Especially in moments like this, where we're seeing a lot of social workers spending a lot of time with children in distress. Think about school social workers right now. Not only are they responsible for healing the wounds and holding the space and for migrant and refugee kids and children of undocumented parents, but right now it's for LGBTQ kids, and especially in states like Texas, for trans kids who are under threat, children of color who are scared. They're having to heal and hold space and respond to the behaviors and give hope to and calm to all of those groups right now. So it's going to be really, really important for me that I take really, really good care of myself. Because I deserve it. But two, the best gift that I can give my clients is my regulation, is my calm, is my hope for them. And so I got to keep recharging. And so how do we recharge here, right? I think a lot of us, when we think about self-care, we think about, hey, if I can just get to the end of the week and I could have a date with my partner or go hang out with my friends or go do a power workout or whatever it might be. And that's just, and I get that, right? That's just enough self-care to keep my head above water, right? But that's not anything that's sustainable, and it's certainly not going to provide me with the level of calm and regulation that I'm going to need to truly share with my clients, especially because they're more dysregulated and scared and traumatized right now. I'm going to need more of it. Now, let's imagine though, let's take a social worker. Typical day for a social worker, they come into work, right, and they start encountering the stressors, clients, colleagues, judges, case notes, right? All the stuff that you guys deal with every day, right? And throughout the day, you're becoming more and more stressed, more and more alarmed, perhaps more and more dysregulated, and even more and more traumatized if you're taking on the traumas of the kids or the families that you're working with. And let's say you just keep doing that all day and you just get all the way up here, right? And then at the end of the day, hopefully you can shut some of that off and regulate a little bit. I know for a lot of you can't or you don't. And you just kind of stay in a state, and then hopefully you get some sleep and you come back and you do it all again the next day. Well, I'm going to tell you something. We're not wired for that level. There's nothing that I know about the brain or the nervous system that would make me believe that any one of you are wired for that type of a day, that level of stress. Now, let's imagine that same social worker, they come in and same caseload, same stressors, same clients, judges, colleagues, whatever it might be. But throughout the day, they're stopping, even if it's for 5 or 10 minutes, and they're doing mindfulness, or they're going to exercise, or they're going for a quick walk, or they're reading, or listening to some music, whatever it might be, even for a few minutes. Not only are they regulating the stress and the trauma and the dysregulation that they're being exposed to with their clients, they're doing something far more important. And I'm going to go back to one of our first slides where I told you we wire for the world that we live in. And we can understand that. Remember, we did the 2 baby analogy? And those kids wire for their world based on their environment, and they answer to their environment. Well, every single one of you, your brain doesn't stop doing that after the do or die stages of early childhood. We continue to do that. All of us are doing this right now. We give our brains a template of experience. It makes meaning out of that experience, right? And answers to our environment, meaning it gives us what we need for that environment. Now, if all that I give my brain is stress and trauma and client after client, stress, trauma, dysregulation, loneliness, because I'm doing this all alone, stress, all of those sorts of things, TikTok videos maybe every once in a while, and more stress, more loneliness, more trauma, okay, my brain is going to say, okay, I need to answer to an environment where you give me nothing but stress and trauma and loneliness in TikTok videos and work. Now, unfortunately for us, I don't need any of the sophisticated parts of my cortex for a world where I'm just dealing with stress, trauma, loneliness, and TikTok videos. Now, if I change that, and now all of a sudden, I tell my brain, hey, I'm giving you a lot of mindfulness. I'm giving you a lot of exercise. I'm giving, more importantly, right? Hey, self-regulation is great, but we are made for co-regulation, right? We are relational creatures. I'm going to happy hour with my friends or my colleagues. I'm going on dates with my partner. I'm spending time with my family. Right? I'm having those coffees that I've been promising everybody in my life that never tend to happen because I just don't have time for them because they're just not important enough. Now I'm actually doing those things. Now my brain has to contend for that. And so what's happening is I'm not simply regulating the stress of my life, keeping my head above water. I'm doing something far, far more important. I'm changing that environment. And so now I'm shifting from the environment for that baby that's chaotic and unpredictable to the one that's nurturing and loving and protective and warm and relational. Because now my brain has to say, you need the really, really good resources to navigate this environment now that has all this mindfulness and all of this exercise and all of this coffee and happy hours and dates and all of that. I'm hoping that's making sense to us. The last thing that I want to talk about is the importance of connection here and the healing power of it. As I said before, the only thing worse than to experience trauma is to experience it all alone. And for many migrant and refugee kids, they're experiencing this all alone. The only thing that can heal these type of wounds and regulate this level of stress is connectedness. That's the role that we play, right? Building connection, being the person that names those wounds, being the person that tells kids it's not okay, right, that this is happening to you. It's normal to feel this way. I'm sorry that I am here for you. That is going to be more important than ever. Connectedness is my favorite quote from Bruce Perry. Connectedness is the only thing that has the power to counterbalance adversity. And we're talking about a population here who, understandably, to survive, right, and to adapt to this, are going small, right? They have to close off from those sources of connection. So if we have any opportunity to help to build that for kids, hey, and maybe we can talk about things where you don't tell me what's going on with your family because you're worried and you don't want something to happen. That's okay. But I'm going to make sure that you know that I'm here and that I care about you. And if we have opportunities to go and advocate or march or speak up to show those kids, hey, you're worth fighting for and speaking up for. The only thing worse than to experience trauma is to experience it all alone. Trauma can make, this is a Bessel van der Kolk quote, trauma can make the world into a gathering of aliens. And I would imagine for a lot of children, a lot of families who are undocumented right now, this is their reality. So let's close by really, really emphasizing the healing power of connection, relationships for these young people and for their families. Thank you all so much. Take good care.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our Unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.